This whole thing of Chris Stearns driving to Orlando in the middle of the night to meet Jenn and Stephan at a hotel has bothered me from the get-go. There's a number of reasons for this. Firstly, the stories don't match. So my understanding, based on what Jenn was saying, was that when they realised that they weren't allowed back in the townhouse, having been just told that, they couldn't afford accommodation. They couldn't go to Jenn's parents' or Jenn's mother's house because Jenn's mum didn't like Stephan, and so they were out on the street with nowhere to go, no money, and so Chris Stearns drove to Orlando in the middle of the night to check them into a hotel. On the surface, okay, but then here's where it all starts to fall apart. You have different stories from different people, and there's issues with the timeline. There's issues with who paid for the hotel. There's issues with why the heck did Chris Stearns drive to Orlando in the middle of the night in the first place. There's issues with when he actually phoned Stephan, or when Stephan and Jenn actually phoned Chris and asked him to go to Orlando to get them into a hotel. There's so many things around this that just don't add up. And then, of course, there's this whole thing of him having arrived in Orlando and everyone settles himself into the hotel, and then Stephan just does this trip down to their house at Northport, or possibly to the storage unit. And that's all a bit vague, and I think that's been kept vague because I personally believe that the people, like the investigators, police, etc., are a little bit wary of Chris Stearns, and so they're not letting out some of the information as to whether or not they believe that Stearns actually did go to the storage unit. But you just have these things that just don't quite add up, and it has been bothering me for some time. And then when I was going through the audio that I got for Chris Stearns and Deb Stearns, there was one bit of audio that really stuck out, and it made me go back to this whole scenario of him travelling to Orlando in the middle of the night to book into a hotel with Jenn and Stephan because apparently they couldn't afford it. So what I've done in this video is I've pulled together a bunch of clips which show some contradictions and show things that to me are something of a red flag. So I'm going to go through them and I'm going to discuss them along the way. Most of the clips from this video are from my own videos, although the interview with Jenn Stephan is actually from Grizzly True Crime. So she's actually done a case file, a Jenn Stephan case file, which is every single Jenn Stephan interview in order, no interruptions, and I'll leave the link for that below for anyone who wanted to go and have a look at that. So all bar one of these videos are in chronological order. I was going to try and arrange them like to fit together as far as what was said, but I realised that it's probably better to just go through them in chronological order, and that may give us a better idea of what is actually going on here. So let's jump in with the first one.
What time did you get here last night?
3 a.m.
3 a.m. When you got here, where did you meet your son and Jennifer?
We apparently pulled up at the same time at the hotel.
Perfect. Okay. When you guys got there, what did you guys end up doing?
We checked into the rooms. They had 239, I had 203. Opposite ends of the building, I brought my stuff up, went over, said goodnight, and then hit the sack.
So the thing with listening to these in chronological order is that there is that whole notion of recency in his mind. This interview was done on the 28th. So this was done the day that they arrested Stephan. Basically the day after Chris Stearns, or the day of, I guess, if you consider it being early morning. So this is the same day that he actually checked into the hotel. So here he's telling us, or telling the officers, that he arrived at the hotel at 3 a.m. and he arrived at the same time as Jenn and Stephan, and then they checked in, as in him, Jenn and Stephan, they all checked in at the same time. He got his bags out of the car, put them in his room, dropped in to say goodnight to Jenn and Stephan, and went to bed. So that's a very succinct timeline that he's given us there. There's no hovering around chatting with Jenn and Stephan or anything, saying that he arrived at 3 a.m, etc. So this actually starts to change as the interviews progress.
So I went to bed.
How long did it take you to get from Orlando to there?
Well, with no traffic out last night, 2.5 hours.
Okay.
But if you're dealing with traffic early this morning, you're going to be looking at close to 3.
So here is the first discussion of how long it takes to get from Northport to Orlando. And he's saying it takes about 2.5 hours, or in morning traffic about 3. Now, 2.5 hours would be at a normal time of day. I know that because I actually Googled it, because I was curious about the time frame. So if you were doing this with no traffic at like 12 o'clock in the morning, or between 12 and 3 a.m, it would take less than 2.5 hours, is what I would imagine. So if he's saying that he arrived at 3, that means that he had to have left sometime after 12:30, which is plausible, and I'll come back to that in a little while.
So,
How long did it take you to get up here last night?
Pretty good time.
When you say pretty good time,
There's no traffic.
so what?
None on 75 and nothing on, so I think I got up here, I'm definitely under 3 hours, but I would say at least 2.5 hours.
So again, he's saying 2.5 hours, between 2.5 hours to 3 hours for him to have travelled there in those early hours of the morning, which doesn't quite sound right to me. To me, I would imagine it would have to have been under 2.25 hours, because he's saying there's no traffic. Now, I'm not, of course, familiar with traffic in Florida, so I could be completely way off base here. So feel free to comment on this and bring me up to speed if I'm not quite right. But my understanding from looking at travel times and stuff is that at that time of the morning it would have been less than 2.25 hours.
Try to figure out where we were going to stay, because had no idea. So we found a place out there off of Western Parkway. So I think I left around midnight and got up here 2:45ish.
So here is the first instance of the timeline starting to shift a bit. Now, instead of arriving at 3, he's arriving at 2:45, and he's saying that he left around midnight. So he's implying here that it took him 2.75 hours. So there's still something that's not quite adding up here with this timeline. And don't forget, this is an interview that's done shortly after he had actually done the trip, basically. So it's interesting that he's gone from, well, it takes roughly 2.5 hours, and I got there around 3, to I left around midnight and got there around 2:45. Now, saying 2:45 and saying 3 could just be an approximation thing, and that perhaps while he's been having this conversation, he's thought it through in his head and has adjusted it a little bit. But he doesn't actually say, well, actually, I thought it was around 3, but I think it must have been around 2:45. He just changes the time without any comment on the fact that he's changing the time. And yeah, like I said, it's only a 15-minute gap, so it could just be that it's an approximation thing, but it is still a change in the narrative.
How did you get to Kissimmee? Like, what made you go to Kissimmee?
Okay, so I got a call. I got a call at 9:30, and then I think that's when that discussion took place about whether to give this phone to the police or not. I said, "You haven't got any issue with it? Give them the phone. Give them the phone." And then I got a call. And then I went to bed. I was 10 or something. I'm all tucked into bed. I got the boys with me, and I may have been partially asleep because I had my phone on silent. And then I woke up because the phone was vibrating, and then my watch would have been in the office. So the phone was vibrating. By the time I got it, there was no connect. So then that was at 10:42, and then I made an out call at 10:43, and then the conversation was about, you need to come up here.
And who says that?
They both did because they were on speaker.
Okay.
And Stephan said, "Hey, you need to come up here." And I said, "Okay." I said, so we discussed, they were being kicked out. They didn't have a place to stay. So I said, well, we need to figure out where to go for, where to stay and what have you. And so I'm jumping in the shower, packing a bag, talking to Dad, making plans to leave, which I did it just after midnight. I tried to make a call to them at 11:56. It went to voicemail, and then I called her back at, now we're into Wednesday, so I called her back at 12 to let them know I was on my way.
Now, this particular audio was from the 6th of March, so it was a bit later on, and you'll note that he's actually looking at times where he's actually made his own timeline, so he's recorded those times. So these are kind of specific times that essentially we can say are actually correct because he's actually recorded them. That's important. And the thing is, I've listened to all these interviews, but I had completely missed that whole section before and hadn't realised the significance of it. So he is saying that he had a few phone calls on that evening before he drove to Orlando. There was one at 9:30 where he says that he discussed with Stephan about Stephan handing his phone over to authorities. Straight away, that's problematic because the interview with Stephan on that evening when they took his phone was actually 2 hours prior to that. So if he had a conversation with them at 9:30, and if this is one that he's actually recorded as that being the actual time frame, he can't have actually had a conversation with Stephan where he said, you should hand over your phone if you've got nothing to hide. Because at that point in time, Stephan's phone was already handed over. So this conversation would have occurred on Jenn's phone. Now, I'm pretty certain that obviously the investigators probably would have seen that discrepancy and realised that that was a discrepancy, and this is perhaps one of the reasons why they were a little bit reluctant with some of the information that they gave Chris Stearns. So that was the first red flag for me. him talking about him encouraging Stephan to hand over his phone, when in actual fact that phone call occurred after the interview that Stephan did, when he was required to hand over his phone. Now, next he talks about having gone to bed and being woken up by his phone vibrating. Now, the first thing that was odd to me was the way he starts telling the story as, I got woken up by my phone vibrating, and then and he starts to say something about his watch, and then he corrects himself like, oh no, my watch would have been in my office. To me, that was a huge red flag. That tells me that either he's lying about his watch being in his office, or he's lying about him having gone to bed. And why would that be the case? So basically, what I'm taking away from this is him telling us that when he goes to bed, he takes his watch off. And when you look at the interviews, it is one of those big, chunky Apple Watches. So I could imagine why a lot of nights I take my Fitbit off when I go to bed, because even that just feels uncomfortable. So the information he's giving us here is that he takes his Apple Watch off when he goes to bed. But he's saying that in this narrative, his Apple Watch did do something at the same time that his phone was vibrating. So either he didn't take his Apple Watch and put it in his office, or he wasn't in bed, one of the two. And maybe that's not a huge red flag, but to me it's definitely showing some kind of deception going on here, which I'm really curious to know what the actual story is. Now here's where things get really interesting, and I hadn't picked this up before, but it is hugely significant. He says he missed the call, it was 10:42, and he says that he rang back at 10:43. He makes it clear that he made that call at 10:43. And he says that in that call, he spoke to both of them on speakerphone, and that they informed him that they were being thrown out of the apartment and that they didn't have anywhere to go. And then he says that he left after midnight. Well, that sounds logical, you say? Sure it does. Except Jenn Soto's interview, where at the end of the interview they told her, sorry, but you can't go back into the townhouse, we're locking it down, you have to find somewhere else to stay tonight. That ended after midnight. Specifically, that ended at 9 minutes past 12. So he's basically saying that they rang him to say that they were being thrown out of the townhouse and that they didn't have anywhere to go, an hour and a half before that actually occurred. Or an hour and 20 minutes, either way. It doesn't add up. If they were only told at 10 past 12, essentially, that they couldn't go back to the townhouse, how could they possibly have then been ringing him at 11:15 to say that they've just been told they can't go back into the townhouse? That doesn't add up at all. Now, he says that he left after midnight, and he seems to be quite consistent with that. And I find that interesting, because the thing that I was particularly curious about when it comes to this timeline is him commenting on the door, the keypad for the door, the battery being flat for that, and also saying, we had decided to change providers for our Ring doorbells, so they were disconnected and the modem was sitting on my office floor. So to me, those two things seem way too coincidental when you combine that with the fact that Stephan travelled down to Northport overnight. Because it would mean that the only access that he had to the house would have been through the back door. And you'll note that in all these interviews, there is not one mention of the back door. I've actually done another video where I talk about all this, and I show pictures of the side gates to their house, because he claims, well, the back of the house is gated. It's not gated, they're just regular garden gates that you can easily get through. Or Stephan could have quite easily jumped the fence. But I've explained that in another video. So to me, it seems super convenient that you have the Ring doorbell, the camera, disconnected. You have the keypad for the lock, the front door, not working, meaning that there's no digital evidence of anyone entering the house during the night. You have Deb Stearns doing this overreaction of, oh, horror, horror, imagine what would have happened if he'd have actually been able to get into the house. Like, what's with that? Because he was living with them. He had only left a few days earlier to go and spend time with Jenn, and he was going to be going back down there at the end of the week. So it didn't make sense for her to do that dramatic reaction to infer that she was afraid of what he might have done to her had he been able to get into the house. That just does not add up. So you have this time frame between 10:43 and sometime after 12, and that's a big enough time frame for someone to perhaps take the batteries out of the keypad on the front door and to remove the modem for the Ring cameras. So all of a sudden we have the narrative changing here. Essentially, Stearns has basically just told us now that the reason that he went to Orlando actually wasn't because of them needing to get into a hotel and him needing to pay for that, because they had rang him before they knew that they were locked out of the townhouse. So he had made some arrangement with them already at 10:43 for him to travel to Orlando, when in actual fact it had nothing to do with getting them into a hotel, because at 10:43 they still would have been expecting to go back into the townhouse, because they weren't informed of it until 12:09, or just before 12:09. So there's something here that this just rips the whole narrative apart. So let's listen to some more clips to see what else is going on here with this narrative.
And then I got a call from them at 1:18, lasted for 2 minutes, and then at 1:51, 50 seconds, because I arrived at the hotel.
So he's locking in a timeline here based on phone calls. And he says, I got a phone call from them at 1:51 and 50 seconds, which disconnected because I arrived at the hotel. So he didn't arrive at the hotel at 3 or 2:45. He arrived at the hotel at 1:50. He's telling them this information a week later, and yet on the day that he had arrived at the hotel, he thought it was 3 a.m. So there's something really hinky going on here. Why would you think 3 a.m. if you know that you got a phone call at 1:51 because that was the time that you arrived at the hotel. So that also calls into question the travel time. He says he left shortly after 12, so that means that he got there in under 2 hours. Now, I could actually believe that, because I would imagine that him saying, well, look, it takes roughly 2.5 hours, and him being vague about how long it took him to get there, probably had more to do with him taking advantage of there being no traffic on the road and speeding, as opposed to him trying to be evasive over the timeline. So I suspect that in this case he was being evasive because he didn't want to tell police that he was driving above the speed limit.
What were the conversation at the 118 area? What was that conversation about?
Just confirmation of where they were and where we were staying and the address of the hotel, because
Okay.
it was out off of west of Disney off the 429.
And from what I understand, did you pay for the hotel or did they pay for
They
it?
paid for theirs, and I paid for mine, but then it said a pet-friendly hotel, pet-friendly if you pay $150 for the night.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so, all right, so I paid for the dog to stay.
Okay, their dog.
Yeah,
Okay.
well, I actually reimbursed her for it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so there's another part of the narrative blown to smithereens. First of all, he had a conversation with them while he was still on the road at 1:20 as to where the hotel was that they were staying at, meaning that they were already checked in. And he also says here that they paid for their hotel room. They also paid for the dog and he reimbursed them. So why did he need to get there at 2 a.m. in the morning if they were able to pay for themselves to get into the hotel room and if they had paid for the dog to be in the hotel room? Why pay for a hotel room overnight when you could just leave in the morning? It actually wasn't urgent for him to be there, especially to get to Orlando and then for everyone to apparently all go to bed. It doesn't make sense.
All right, and when you got to the hotel, you had conversations with Jenn Stephan, I'm assuming?
Yeah, we were just greeting, gave Stephan a hug and, chit-chatted for a few minutes. I was busy checking in because they had already completed their check-in. They went up to their room. They were on the opposite end of me, but we were on the same floor. I went out to the car, park my car, get my stuff and bring it in and go to my room. And then I went to their room, spent about 10 minutes with them, no more than 15, and then I was heading back to my room to go to bed.
What were the conversations when you were in their room?
I don't really recall. It was just, everybody settled in, everybody okay, we'll just meet in the morning.
So here he clearly states they were already checked in. And the other thing that changes here in the narrative is that as opposed to bringing his stuff up from the car and then just dropping in to say goodnight, he's actually spent time in the room having a conversation with them. He claims, 10, no more than 15 minutes. Well, at this point in time, when you look at all the other inconsistencies, to me, I'm questioning how long that conversation was actually for. Why was it so important for him to get there in the middle of the night when they were already checked into the hotel to just then have a 15-minute conversation? There's definitely something that's not being said here. And to me, the only reason that I can think of for him being there in the middle of the night when they didn't need him to physically check them into the hotel, for him to actually spend the money on a night in the hotel when he could have left home in the morning and met with them in the morning, the only possibility to me is that all three of them were complicit. That somehow he knew something about what was going on. Jenn knew something about what was going on. Otherwise, explain to me how this whole hotel thing actually adds up.
I said, boy, that's an unusual response to smile about this bird. And I said, hope the beater was just way off. But then, it carried forward into Wednesday. I don't think I would have come up, but then I wouldn't have learned some other things about her had I not come. But it's like, why was I brought to Orlando? Mm-hmm. Unless to get me out of the house.
Which left me here alone.
Mm-hmm. Now that is super interesting. After this whole narrative of him having to go to Orlando to pay for them to get into a hotel and to support them, now he's saying that, well, having watched the interview on TV of Jenn, that something was off there and he doesn't know why he had to go to Orlando other than to get him out of the house. Whose idea was it for him to go in the middle of the night? Because he seems like a pretty assertive guy. And from everything else we hear from these parents, they tell their son how it's going to be. So why would his son have been the one to dictate, no, you have to come in the middle of the night, pay for a night in a hotel room, rather than come in the morning, which is what would be the logical thing to do. So I don't buy it at all. I think there's a bit of truth leaking out here, and that they did need him in Orlando, maybe to provide a key, maybe to provide a credible alibi. I don't know. But to me, they've just by essentially saying, oh, maybe it was to get me out of the house, and, she pipes in with, and to have me there on my own. Maybe this was all part of a plan. Because we know that the Sunday morning before Stearns left Northport, he had been using his computer apparently. And yet when Chris Stearns handed it over to police, it had no hard drive. Who removed the hard drive and when? Was this what was arranged? Did Chris Stearns go to Orlando maybe to give a backdoor key to his son so he could get into the house and remove the hard drive and get rid of it? Or there's something going on here. It is not logical. The time frame is wrong. The narrative is wrong.
The other interesting thing is, as you know, I came up early Wednesday morning, 2 o'clock, checked into the hotel, tucked Steph and Jenn into their room and left 2:20, 2:30. I went to bed.
Okay, so now he's saying he went to bed around 2:30 or 2:40, meaning that they were in Jenn and Stephan's room talking for 40 minutes to 50 minutes. What were they talking about? Why did he have to get there in the middle of the night? If you had just driven in the middle of the night, you arrive somewhere at 2 a.m. What's so important that you're then going to sit up for 50 minutes and talk about? Why couldn't it all wait till the morning? And why is he trying to be evasive and make it sound like they just said goodnight and went to bed?
And I had my timeline all screwed up. I thought they parted their room at 3:30 when in fact it was more like 2:30. So I was thinking, gosh, I just went to bed, and then he turned around and got out of there and went down to Northport.
Unfortunately, I found out couple days later, if I had seen that TV interview that they held the next day, my attitude and demeanor with him would have been considerably different than me making the trip to Orlando and helping he and Maddie out, or Jennifer out, for sure.
The police kicked everybody out of the townhouse and quarantined it, roped it off. They had no money. They had no place to go. He didn't want to go to the in-laws' house, of course, or to her mother's house. They got along like oil and water. But it was, Chris went there to get them into a hotel and to be there as emotional support for them for a missing child, not for anything else.
So this is from the September interview, and she's giving the narrative that we now know is incorrect. They didn't need him to go to Northport to get them into the hotel because they'd already paid for it themselves. They paid for the dog. He reimbursed them for that. So it wasn't some mercy dash to get to Orlando so that they weren't sleeping in their car overnight, which is what she's essentially implying. And I find it interesting that she's like, oh, and it was there to do that and to provide support for a missing child, not for anything else. Now, I know in this interview they were being defensive because people were throwing accusations at them. And, well, when you have these consistent inconsistencies, that is why. But for her to emphasise that, I just found that interesting. So, to me, there's lies stacked upon lies here. What is the actual truth of this situation?
But the amount of time that I had from 2:15 Wednesday morning until 4 p.m., I spent a total of 35 minutes with them.
Okay, so let me just point out again that the timeline is once again out of whack. And it sounds like he spent more than 35 minutes with them. So I'm now going to play some excerpts from the sworn interview that Jenn Stephan did. This was the one where they basically called her in April and they gave her immunity from prosecution from anything she said in that particular interview, but basically said, if you lie, we still come at you. So theoretically, what she's saying in this interview is supposed to be correct. And have a listen and think about the things that I've just discussed in terms of the timeline and the reasoning for Chris Stearns going to Orlando. And let's listen to what Jenn has to say about it.
I think at this point, when I noticed that forensics was locking down the house and you guys said we couldn't come back, I told him to call his dad. Because I had a feeling y'all knew something and it was going to come down on him. And I'm just like, they're focusing on the wrong person. They have the wrong person. In my head, I'm convinced you guys are that you had the wrong person. I'm trying to think back to what exactly we were talking about. I know I remember late in the evening, like when you guys let us know we couldn't come back, and I called his dad, or we called his dad. I started saying to him, like, I think they're focusing in on you. Like, we need to call your dad, and I think we need to get you a lawyer. I feel like they're focusing on the wrong person, and he kept saying the same thing. We call his dad. We tell his dad to come down here, and his dad did come down here and met us at a hotel. That was another thing. I don't have that much money. I live off of disability. I couldn't afford to put us up on a hotel. Like, when you guys said that we couldn't return, I was like, I didn't know where to go. I was trying to think if any family member would have a spare room or anything like that, and not that could take the three of us, when I say three of us, I mean him and the dog. And I know at my mom's house we wouldn't have been welcome. My mom does not like Stephan. She's never liked Stephan. So I knew that our only option was to go to a hotel, but I couldn't afford it. So we called Chris, and Chris met us at a hotel by Disney,
Okay.
off of Western Way, and that's where we went. We got there pretty late. We checked in. I used the restroom, and I was getting ready for bed, or laying down in bed probably around 3:30, 3:45 in the morning, and I fell asleep. Stephan was already asleep at this point.
Did you go straight to sleep when you got in, or just kind of drifted off as you were falling asleep? Like you went to the bathroom and he goes straight to bed?
He was already in bed before I went to the bathroom.
Okay.
So again, we have Jenn saying that she had no money for a hotel, so that's why they rang Chris, and that he came to rescue them essentially because they couldn't afford a hotel, which, according to Chris Stearns, isn't the case. Someone's lying here. Either Jen's lying or Chris is lying. But also, when she does talk about them ringing Chris, she's again talking about how she believes that they're looking at the wrong person, and that's why they rang Chris. So she's given two reasons for them ringing Chris. Now, he has said, according to the timeline, he said that the phone call for them asking him to go to Orlando occurred at 10:43, which was before they knew that they were locked out of the townhouse. So to me, what's happening here is that they actually did ring him and say, Stephan's in trouble, we need you to come and help fix it. Because we know that they did not ring him to say, come and pay for a hotel or come and help us find somewhere where we can spend the night, because at the time when they rang him, they didn't know that. So definitely there's some major irregularities going on here. Also, note that she avoids talking about having any conversations with Chris Stearns before going to bed. According to her, they just basically checked into the hotel and went to bed. But here's an interesting thing. Her timeline actually does match up with Chris Stearns' timeline. If you go with the original time of 3 a.m. or whatever, him saying that he was mistaken and he went to bed at 2:30 or 2:45 or something. She's saying, oh, we went to bed around 3:30 or 3:40 or 3:45. So to me, even if, well, either they both got their timelines wrong and they all went to bed at 2:45, or there's a significant thing here with the timeline and they were talking for quite some time before they went to bed. Either we know he arrived at 1:51. He is pretty clear on that. He's saying he knows that based on his phone. So you have a 1 hour or a 2 hour discrepancy here between him arriving at the hotel and them all going to bed. Either way, there is a huge time discrepancy. And speaking of time discrepancies, now at one point he says that he arrived at the same time as them at the hotel. But at a different point he says they were already checked in. Now if they were already checked in, then yeah, that's feasible. They left the interview at 12:05, found a hotel, checked in, rang him at 1:20 and said this is where the hotel is, and then waited for him to arrive. But if you have the other story where he says we all arrived at the same time, where were they for 2 hours? So I think that it seems to fit that they did actually go straight to the hotel and check in after Jenn's interview. And like he said, they rang him while he was on the road to tell him which hotel it was. But that totally blows the whole him going there to get them into a hotel thing out of the water completely. I'm going to play you just one more clip, and this doesn't directly connect to the hotel, but it does connect to Stearns making the trip down to Northport in the middle of the night, and I'll explain why in a moment.
A Wednesday, since he didn't have his phone, I had a spare phone I used for business, which I think you guys have, iPhone mini, and I said, here, use this until you get your phone back. Again, thinking everything's innocent and what have you. And so I gave that to him around 3 o'clock Wednesday afternoon.
So he gave Stephan a spare phone at 3 o'clock Wednesday afternoon. He didn't arrive at the hotel and go, by the way, here's a spare phone that I brought with me because you had told me that your phone had been taken. He had to have intentionally made the choice to take the phone with him when he left Northport so that he could provide Stephan with a spare phone, and yet he didn't give it to him until 3 o'clock in the afternoon. That seems really odd to me, unless it was timed that way so that Stephan didn't have any devices on him that could be tracked in the middle of the night, for example. I'll leave you with that thought. Thanks for listening. I know it's been a long one. Hopefully you've kept up with all the back and forth over this, but I thought it was an important one and I wanted to do it all in one video. If you're new, please subscribe, hit the like button, and leave a comment below. Now that we've looked at all the discrepancies, what do you think was really going on here?